I am Grace Bennett, 27, and the day my family showed me what love meant to them began at a crowded check-in counter in Atlanta. My grandfather Thomas stood beside me with his ticket folder clutched like a promise, his smile lined with years of work and hope. The agent typed frowned and said she couldn't find his reservation. Something in my father's face went still. "Dad, it must have slipped through the cracks," he murmured, eyes dry as stone, and then he told him to head home. The terminal kept moving, but I didn't. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and tap that like and subscribe if you've ever held on to someone you love when everyone else let go. I grew up in Charleston in a world where porches were wide, Sunday clothes were pressed, and the biggest house didn't always feel like the safest place to stand. My father, Stephen, liked a glossy entrance handshakes that landed like signatures, stories that ended with him on top, while my mother, Marianne, polished our lives for photographs, charity luncheons, holiday cards, the kind of smiles that looked practiced even when they weren't. I learned good manners, firm handshakes, and to say please and thank you. But what stuck deeper came from my grandfather. Thomas taught me to bring casseroles when someone was sick, to return phone calls even when the answer was no, to keep my word when it cost me something. He kept a workbench in his garage lined with tools older than I was, and he let me hammer bent nails straight, just to show me how patience can give broken things another life. Money separated our rooms, even when we shared the same roof. My parents loved restaurants with linen napkins and valet stands. Thomas loved diners, where the coffee came strong and the waitress knew his order. At home, we spoke in careful phrases: investment, return, image. With Thomas, talk was plain. He told me about hauling lumber when he had nothing but determination, and a borrowed truck about the first duplex he bought, about the year he nearly lost it all, but paid his crew first and ate beans for dinner. He never used those stories to demand anything from us. He told them like maps, as if knowing the route might help us find our way when the road ran dark. The rift began quietly, the way a floorboard loosens, before anyone hears it creak. My father's calls to Thomas picked up not on birthdays or holidays, but in the middle of ordinary weeks. My Aunt Trish started dropping by with bakery boxes and questions about summer travel. The talk gathered around one shining idea: Paris, Rome, London, one last full family trip, first-class seats, hotels I'd only seen in magazines. I watched Thomas listen, his hands folded, his eyes soft, with a kind of hope I hadn't seen in years, and I wished I could trust the sudden warmth that filled our house. He loved the plan because he loved us, and because loving us had always meant believing the best. He asked me if I thought the flight would be too long for him. I said I'd sit beside him, and we'd make it in steps, coffee after takeoff, a walk down the aisle to stretch stories to pass the hours. He laughed and told me he wanted to see the Eiffel Tower lit at night, not because a brochure said he should, but because he'd promised my grandmother he would one day, and he'd run out of excuses not to go. The suitcase he pulled from his closet was old, the leather worn smooth by other roads, and he set it by the door a week early, as if readiness could protect a man from disappointment. The change in our house was visible, almost theatrical. My mother bought new luggage and laid outfits across the bed. My father found reasons to mention exchange rates and restaurants that required reservations weeks in advance. Trish shared a list of must-see sites. Rob chimed in about vineyard tours. Lily and Noah scrolled and smiled without looking up. The talk was all sparkle, but beneath it, I felt a draft and absence that brushed my skin when nobody else seemed to notice. When my parents thought I was out, they spoke in low voices that carried anyway. Numbers threaded through the halls, and the word transfer landed with a thud I couldn't ignore. I told myself doubt was ungrateful, that families earn new starts, one small good choice at a time. Thomas believed it, and I wanted to meet him there on the better side of us. He looked younger with a plan in his pocket, and when he walked a little slower some afternoons, he said it was just the summer heat. I made lists, his medications, his favorite snack for the plane, the travel pillow he liked. I didn't ask to see the bookings because I wanted to be the granddaughter who trusted, rather than the one who kept score. The morning we left for Atlanta, the sky over Charleston was clear, and the air held that faint salt smell that always makes me think of starting over. 2 SUVs idled in the drive trunks, open luggage lined up like chess pieces. My father joked about jet lag. My mother snapped a photo of our adventure and tagged it with a heart. Thomas took my arm as we walked to the car, and I felt steady because he did. The highway unspooled billboards and pine trees and miles of easy conversation, and by the time we rolled our suitcases across the terminal floor, we were laughing about who would fall asleep first after takeoff. The line moved quickly until it didn't. The agent's fingers tapped the screen, lit and dimmed, and something unseen rearranged the room. My father's voice went smooth in the way it does when he wants a deal to go his way, and my mother laid a hand on his sleeve as if touch could make the story true. I saw Thomas lift his ticket folder a little higher, as if offering it might help, and I felt the floorboard give beneath us the creak I'd been telling myself not to hear. When the agent looked up and said she didn't have him anywhere on the manifest, I watched his smile falter by a fraction and understood that whatever was happening had begun long before we stepped into that line. The air inside the terminal shifted the moment the ticket agent looked up. "I'm sorry," she said, eyes flicking to my grandfather. "There's no reservation under a Thomas Bennett." My father leaned across the counter, his voice smooth and practiced. "There must be a mistake." She tried again, typing faster this time, her fingers pausing mid-keystroke before she shook her head. My grandfather's smile thinned as he opened his folder. His hands trembled slightly, paper brushing against the counter. "I was told everything was confirmed," he said, quietly. My father sighed, low and deliberate. "Dad, I must have forgotten to book your ticket. It's been hectic." The words landed like a closing door. I turned to him, searching for a hint of embarrassment, but he just straightened his jacket and checked his watch. My mother stepped closer, her tone soft and polished. "Thomas, maybe this is for the best. A long flight like that could wear you out. We'll bring you something lovely from Paris." My aunt nodded, eager to agree, while my cousins stood a few feet away, half listening, half scrolling through their phones. Around us, the line moved on. Luggage rolled, scanners beeped, and the sound of ordinary life swallowed the small space between our words. My grandfather's eyes darted from one face to another, searching for an answer that didn't come. "You mean, you're going without me?" His voice cracked just enough to make people nearby glance over. My father forced a smile. "Don't make a scene, Dad. We'll plan something else when we get back." I felt heat crawl up my neck. "You can't be serious," I said, stepping forward. "He paid for everything. You're really leaving him here." My aunt's expression hardened. "Grace, lower your voice." My mother's hand closed around my arm. "Don't start," she whispered. I pulled away. "Start. He gave you $2 million for this trip. He trusted you." My father's jaw tightened. "Enough." His voice rose just above a whisper, but sharp enough to silence me. "If you want to make this difficult, stay home too. But we're going." I looked at my grandfather, then his suitcase still upright beside him, his fingers curled around the handle as if it were the last solid thing he could hold. His lips parted, but no words came. The noise around us grew distant, muffled, under the weight of what none of them would say out loud. When the agent called, "Next, please," my father turned on his heel. My mother followed, heels clicking. My aunt gathered her family and walked away without looking back. The gates swallowed them, one by one. My grandfather stood still, staring at the space they left behind, his eyes glassy but dry. "Maybe they're right," he murmured. "Maybe I don't belong anymore." I reached for his hand. "You belong with me," I said, my throat tight. "Let's go home." He hesitated only long enough to nod. The drive back to Charleston blurred into gray highway and passing lights. The hum of the tires filled the silence that neither of us knew how to break. My grandfather sat with his suitcase on his knees, staring out the window. Every few miles I saw his reflection in the glass shoulders, slightly hunched, jaw-set eyes unfocused. At one point he whispered something I almost didn't catch. "I built everything for them," he said. "Now I feel like a guest in my own life." I turned toward him, but he didn't look at me. By the time we reached his estate, the night had settled deep and still. The front gates opened with their familiar groan, and the house came into view, tall, stately, and hollow. Inside, the chandeliers glowed like they always did, but the warmth was gone. My grandfather placed his suitcase by the door. It sounded louder than it should have. He walked through the foyer slowly, his footsteps echoing against marble floors he had once been so proud of. "I built this for them," he said again, barely above a whisper. "Every brick, every dollar. And it means nothing. I wanted to tell him it wasn't true, that what he built still mattered, but the words felt thin against everything that had happened. He sank into the leather chair by the fireplace, the same one he'd sat in during holidays and birthdays. His hand reached for a framed photograph on the side table, a family portrait taken years ago, when smiles came easier and time hadn't yet peeled away the pretense. He traced the edges of each face with his thumb, stopping when he reached mine. Then he set it down, turned toward the flames, and said softly, "I suppose money can buy many things, but not hearts." I stood there unsure if he was speaking to me or to the fire. The quiet stretched until the clock in the hallway struck midnight. He didn't move, and I couldn't bring myself to leave him alone. I sat nearby listening to the fire crackle, thinking about how small his world had become in one day. Eventually his breathing slowed steady and deep, and I knew he had drifted to sleep right there in the chair. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the tall windows, catching dust in the air. He was still in the chair, the photograph resting against his chest. I made coffee, hoping the smell would wake him, and when he finally opened his eyes, he looked older than I'd ever seen him. "Morning," I said quietly. He nodded but didn't speak. The silence pressed on until I couldn't bear it. "Grandpa, they can't just take everything and walk away like nothing happened." He looked at me, then the faintest flicker of warning in his eyes. "Gracie said they're still my children." His voice was calm, but his hands trembled. "I won't be the one to destroy what's left." I swallowed hard. "They've already destroyed it," I said softly. He didn't argue, but his gaze dropped to the floor, and I knew he heard me. When he went upstairs to rest, I turned toward his study. The room smelled faintly of cedar and ink, just as it always had. His desk was tidy papers stacked neatly, pens aligned in a row. But there, in the top drawer under a file labeled Travel Plans, I found a bank receipt showing a transfer of $2 million from his investment account to my father's personal one. My pulse quickened. I flipped through the rest of the folder and found the itinerary, glossy brochure's hotel confirmations and a final traveler list. His name was gone. I held the papers tight and drove downtown to the travel agency that had arranged the trip. The woman behind the counter wore glasses and a kind expression. Her name tag read Megan Porter. When I explained who I was, she nodded. "Yes, I remember the Bennett booking. Quite an elaborate package." She typed something into her computer, her brow furrowing as the records loaded. "It was paid in full by Mr. Thomas Bennett, but—" She leaned closer to the screen. "His name isn't on the final manifest. It looks like it was removed before confirmation." The words made my throat tighten. "Do you know who changed it?" She shook her head. "I can't say for sure, but the request came from the same email that handled the rest of the family's arrangements." She paused, studying my face. "If you need a written statement, I can prepare one." I thanked her, barely trusting my own voice. Back at the house, I spread the documents across the dining table. When my grandfather joined me, I didn't speak right away. I just pointed. He sat down slowly, reading each page, as if his eyes could no longer keep up with his heart. "Stephen did this," he asked, voice faint. I nodded. His shoulders sagged, and for a long moment he didn't say a word. Then he looked up, the weight of years pressed into one question. "What do we do now?" I had already thought about that. I told him about the agency I'd found, Adult Protective Services, and how they handled cases of financial abuse against elders. His reaction was immediate. "No, Grace, I can't. They're my family." I met his eyes. "You're their victim, Grandpa." He flinched at the word, but I didn't take it back. "If we let this go, they'll keep doing it. Maybe not to you again, but to someone else." He rubbed his temples, silent for a while, then leaned back with a long breath. "If you believe it's right," he said finally, "then I trust you." That was all I needed. That night, after he went to bed, I sat alone at his desk and opened my laptop. The number for Adult Protective Services glowed on the screen. I hesitated, listening to the quiet hum of the house, the same quiet that used to mean peace, but now felt like defeat. Then I dialed. The voice on the other end introduced himself as Caleb Ortiz, and I began to tell him everything: the money, the trip, the airport, the silence. When I hung up, the first light of dawn touched the horizon outside his window. I looked toward the hallway where my grandfather slept and whispered to myself, "They think they've won." Then I straightened the papers into a neat pile and placed them beside the phone. But this isn't over. The morning after I called Adult Protective Services felt strangely quiet. I half expected my phone to ring or an officer to appear at the door right away, but the house stayed still, sunlight stretching across the marble floors like nothing had changed. My grandfather moved slower than usual, pouring his coffee without looking up. His posture slightly bent, as though the night had weighed him down. When I told him an investigator would contact us soon, he only nodded. "We'll see," he murmured, and carried his cup to the porch. The next few days passed in uneasy rhythm. I worked remotely from his study while he busied himself with small chores that didn't need doing, watering plants that were already damp, straightening photos on the wall, polishing the old brass handles on his office desk. Every so often, I'd catch him staring at the family portrait again. The edges of the frame were worn from where his thumb traced back and forth like a man searching for what had gone missing. I tried to start conversations, but most ended in half-finished sentences. The house echoed with the sound of what neither of us could say. Late one afternoon, the phone rang. I answered on the first ring. "Grace Bennett," a voice asked. "This is Caleb Ortiz, with Adult Protective Services." His tone was calm, professional, but there was a quiet kindness beneath it. "I've reviewed your statement and the documents you sent. I'd like to schedule a visit with you and Mr. Bennett." My chest tightened. When I asked, "Tomorrow morning, if that works. I'll drive up from Columbia." I agreed immediately, though I wasn't sure how my grandfather would take it. That evening I found him in the backyard trimming roses. The air was heavy with the scent of salt from the nearby marsh, and the orange light of sunset caught in his silver hair. "Grandpa?" I began carefully. "The caseworker is coming tomorrow. His name's Caleb Ortiz." He paused mid-cut, the shears hanging in the air. Already he asked quietly. I nodded. He lowered the shears, resting them on the garden wall. "Grace, I don't want this to turn into a circus. They'll think I'm after revenge." I shook my head. "No, they'll think you deserve respect." He didn't answer. Instead, he wiped his hands on his jeans and said, "We'll see what he has to say." The next morning, the sound of tires on gravel announced Caleb's arrival. He was younger than I expected, maybe late 30s, with neat dark hair and a patient expression. He greeted my grandfather with a firm handshake and introduced himself with quiet respect. "Mr. Bennett, my job isn't to cause trouble," he said. "It's to make sure what happened to you doesn't happen again." My grandfather gestured toward the sitting room. "Then come in," he said, voice steady but reserved. Caleb began gently asking questions that pulled the story out piece by piece. When the money was transferred, who handled the travel plans, what was said at the airport. My grandfather answered with calm precision, never raising his voice, though every few minutes his eyes drifted toward the fireplace. I handed Caleb the documents I had gathered, the transfer receipt, the itinerary, and Megan Porter's statement from the agency. He studied each page carefully, making notes on a legal pad. When he finished, he closed the folder and looked at us both. "You've provided substantial proof," he said. "We'll open an official case. I'll contact your father and aunt when they return from their trip. They'll be served with a summons to respond." My grandfather exhaled, his hands tightening around the armrests. "Served," he repeated as if tasting the word. "I never thought I'd see the day I'd have to drag my own children into court." Caleb's expression softened. "Mr. Bennett, you're not dragging them anywhere. You're standing up for yourself. That's something to be proud of." After he left, the house felt different, still quiet, but with a sense of motion under the surface, like wind before a storm. My grandfather sat at the dining table, staring at the folder Caleb had left behind. "Grace," he said slowly, "I never meant for things to end like this. I just wanted them to love each other." I leaned against the doorway, watching him trace the edge of the folder. "Maybe this is the only way they'll understand what love costs when they waste it," I said, my voice soft. He didn't answer, but I saw the flicker of something in his eyes. Not anger, not sorrow exactly, but the first faint spark of resolve. Days turned into weeks. Caleb called occasionally with updates. The investigation was progressing. Documents had been reviewed, statements verified. My grandfather began spending more time in the garden again, pruning and replanting, as though reclaiming small pieces of control. Still, there were nights when I'd hear him pacing down the hall long after midnight. Once I found him sitting at the kitchen table, staring at an old envelope. Inside were letters from my father, short notes written years ago, back when their relationship still had tenderness. He slid them toward me and said quietly, "I kept these because I thought they meant something. Now I don't know what they mean at all." The morning Caleb called to say the family was due back from Europe, my stomach tightened. "They land tomorrow evening," he said. "We'll be there to meet them. I'll bring the paperwork." I looked at my grandfather sitting beside me with his coffee. "You don't have to come," I told him. He shook his head. "Yes, I do. I need to see them look me in the eye." The next day, the airport was crowded again, faces, voices, and the rush of movement blending into a hum. We waited near the arrivals gate, my grandfather standing tall in his pressed jacket, his cane steady against the floor. Caleb stood nearby, a folder under his arm. The doors opened, and out came my family, tanned and laughing, rolling luggage plastered with stickers from Paris and Rome. My father spotted us first, the smile slipping from his face. My mother's hand froze mid-scroll on her phone. "Dad," my father said, voice cautious, "what are you doing here?" Before my grandfather could answer, Caleb stepped forward, his tone even. "Mr. Stephen Bennett, Mrs. Marianne Bennett, Mrs. Patricia Holden, and Mr. Robert Holden, you've been served." He handed each of them an envelope. My aunt blinked, confused. "Served?" "What is this?" Caleb replied. "A summons regarding financial abuse of an elder." The crowd around us began to quiet, curiosity rippling through the terminal. My father's jaw tightened. "This is ridiculous," he said, turning to my grandfather. "Tell them you gave us the money, Dad. Tell them you wanted us to go." My grandfather's voice came steady but low. "I wanted us all to go together," he said. "Not for you to take everything and leave me behind." My mother's face drained of color. My aunt tried to protest, words tumbling over each other, but none of it mattered. I stepped forward, then my voice cutting through the noise. "It wasn't him who called APS," I said. "It was me." My father turned sharply, eyes narrowing. "You did this." His tone carried more disbelief than anger at first, but the fury followed quick behind. "You betrayed your own parents." I held his gaze. "No," I said quietly. "You betrayed him. I just told the truth." For a moment, no one moved. My aunt clutched her purse to her chest. My mother looked around as though searching for a way out, and my father's expression hardened into something unfamiliar, fear disguised as control. Caleb handed them the final document and stepped back. "You'll be contacted with a court date," he said. As they turned to leave, my grandfather reached for my hand. His grip was firm, his voice barely above a whisper. "Grace, thank you." I squeezed back, feeling the tremor in his palm. "You don't have to thank me," I said softly. "You just have to let them see you stand." When we walked out of the airport together, the sun had dipped below the horizon. The parking lot shimmered under orange streetlights, and the evening breeze carried the faint hum of engines and faraway laughter. My grandfather paused by the car, looking back once toward the terminal. "It's strange," he said. "After all these years, I thought losing them would break me. But it feels like I'm finally breathing again." I opened the door for him, and as he settled inside, I knew the hardest part was still ahead. The truth was out, but justice hadn't yet been decided. And deep down I could feel it. The storm that started at that airport was far from over. The drive home from the airport felt longer than it should have. Neither of us spoke much, the sound of the tires filling the silence that trailed behind everything that had happened. My grandfather kept his gaze on the window, watching the highway lights blur into streaks of gold. I could see the weight of it pressing down on him, the confrontation, the disappointment, the hollow kind of relief that came from finally naming the truth out loud. When we reached the house, he didn't wait for me to unlock the door. He walked straight to his study, sat down in his chair, and closed his eyes like a man trying to steady his breathing. The next morning, I found him outside by the porch reading through a stack of papers Caleb had given us. His coffee had gone cold beside him, untouched. "It's really happening," he said, his voice quiet. "They'll have to answer for what they did." I nodded, sitting across from him. The sunlight caught the edge of the papers, and I noticed how his hands shook slightly as he turned each page. "You know," he added, "for years I thought silence was the only way to keep peace. But peace built on lies isn't peace at all." He looked at me, then, eyes tired but clear. "Thank you, Grace. I wouldn't have had the courage without you." Over the next few days, we waited while the case moved forward. The investigators called often, asking for statements for copies of receipts for written testimony. Caleb kept us updated, explaining how the process would unfold. He was patient and steady, the kind of person who spoke plainly and never made promises he couldn't keep. My grandfather started keeping a journal recording everything he could remember about the trip. The phone calls, even the tone of my father's voice when he'd told him to just go home. It was as though he wanted to reclaim the story before someone else could twist it. At night we sat together in the living room with the television on low. The news anchors talked about market changes and politics, but neither of us really listened. The quiet moments between commercials felt heavier than the words on screen. Sometimes he would glance toward the family portraits on the wall, those smiling faces frozen in better years, and his jaw would tighten. "I should have seen it coming," he said once, his tone almost to himself. "I raised them to work hard, but maybe I made it too easy for them. I didn't know how to answer, so I just reached over and took his hand." A week later, Caleb called again. The court date had been set. "They'll have to appear before a judge within 2 weeks," he said. "It's moving faster than usual because of the evidence you provided." I thanked him, though my stomach knotted at the thought. My grandfather was quiet when I told him. He simply nodded and said, "Then we'll be ready." In the days that followed, the house became both a refuge and a reminder. My grandfather spent hours in his workshop repairing an old wooden chest that had belonged to my grandmother. The smell of sawdust drifted through the open door, mixing with the faint salt of the marsh air. Every few minutes, the steady sound of sandpaper against wood filled the silence. "This belonged to her," he said when I brought him a glass of water. "She always said you could fix anything if you were patient enough." He smiled faintly. "I'm trying to believe that." One evening, I stepped into the study to find him sorting through old letters and photographs. He was organizing them into piles, family vacations, business milestones, holidays, and placing them into boxes. "I'm making space," he said without looking up. "I don't want to carry more than I need into the next chapter." The words stayed with me long after I left the room. When the hearing day arrived, the morning air was cool and clear. My grandfather wore his Navy suit, the same one he'd worn to my college graduation. He stood in front of the mirror adjusting his tie. "It still fits," he said with a small smile. "Guess that's something." We drove in silence to the courthouse in downtown Charleston, the streets lined with oak trees draped in gray Spanish moss. Caleb met us at the entrance, his expression calm but focused. "You ready?" he asked. My grandfather took a deep breath. "I've been ready for years." Inside the courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined, wooden benches polished to a shine, a flag in the corner, the state seal above the judge's seat. When my family walked in, I felt the air shift. My father led the way. His shoulders squared, his expression unreadable. My mother trailed behind him, pale and rigid, clutching her handbag like it could shield her. My aunt followed, whispering something sharp to her husband, who kept his eyes on the floor. My cousins didn't come. The judge, a silver-haired woman named Ellen Graves, called the session to order. Caleb presented the case, laying out the documents, the bank transfer, the itinerary without my grandfather's name, and Megan Porter's written statement from the travel agency. My family's lawyer objected twice, but the judge overruled him each time. When Caleb finished, he looked toward me. "Ms. Bennett, please take the stand." I walked forward, my knees slightly shaking. The oath felt heavier than I expected. When I began to speak, I kept my eyes on the judge, not my parents. I described the day at the airport, the check-in counter, the missing ticket, my father's words, my mother's silence. The judge listened, without interrupting her pen, moving slowly across the notepad in front of her. When I finished, Caleb thanked me and gestured toward the bench. Then Megan was called to testify. She spoke clearly, explaining how the booking had been altered, how my grandfather's name had been deleted before the final confirmation. My father's attorney tried to challenge her memory, but she held steady. "I handle hundreds of trips a year," she said, "but that one stood out. It's not every day someone pays that much and doesn't travel." By the time the hearing paused for lunch, the tension in the room felt thick enough to touch. My father cornered me in the hallway, his voice low and sharp. "You think this makes you righteous," he said. "You're tearing this family apart." I met his gaze. "I'm not the one who did that." He stared at me for a long moment, then turned and walked away. When the court reconvened, my grandfather was called to the stand. He moved slowly, but without hesitation. Caleb's questions were gentle dates, transfers, promises made. Then the defense attorney stood. "Mr. Bennett," he began, "you're an accomplished businessman. Isn't it true that you've given financial gifts to your children before?" My grandfather nodded. "Yes, I have." "So why is this any different?" the attorney pressed. My grandfather looked straight ahead. "Because gifts come with love," he said. "This came with betrayal." The room went silent. Even the attorney hesitated before speaking again. "And you're sure this wasn't a misunderstanding?" My grandfather's voice didn't waver. "A misunderstanding doesn't leave you standing alone in an airport with a suitcase you packed for a dream." The judge's pen paused mid-scratch. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. When he stepped down from the stand, I rose to help him back to his seat. His hand was steady in mine, the faintest smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Caleb leaned forward and whispered something to him I couldn't hear, but whatever it was made my grandfather nod. The judge announced that closing statements would begin the next morning. As we left the courtroom, sunlight streamed through the tall windows, painting long shadows across the floor. My grandfather stopped by the door, glancing back once at the room we'd just walked out of. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "we finish this." I held the door open for him, the late afternoon breeze lifting the edge of his jacket. The courthouse bell rang in the distance, and as we stepped into the light, I knew something had shifted inside him. The weight of shame had turned into something stronger resolve. And deep down, I sensed that the next day would bring not just a verdict, but an ending that neither of us could ever go back from. The courthouse felt heavier the next morning. Even the air carried a hush, as though the building itself understood what was about to happen. My grandfather walked beside me slower than usual, his cane steady on the tiled floor. He looked calm, but I could tell he hadn't slept. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper. His expression settled somewhere between exhaustion and resolve. Caleb met us in the hallway, offering a quiet nod. "We're ready," he said. My grandfather straightened his jacket, replying softly, "So am I." Inside the courtroom was nearly full. Reporters hadn't been allowed, but word had spread. A few curious faces filled the back row, whispering as my family filed in. My father kept his chin high, his lawyer trailing just behind. My mother avoided my eyes completely, her hands clutched tightly around her purse. My aunt leaned toward her husband, whispering something sharp enough that I could almost feel it cut the air. The judge entered moments later, and everyone rose. The scrape of chairs echoed off the walls before the silence settled again. Caleb delivered the opening remarks, his tone calm but deliberate. "This is a case about more than money," he said. "It's about trust broken deliberately and without remorse." My father's attorney objected, but the judge lifted a hand. "Overruled," she said simply. When Caleb presented the evidence, it felt like watching a wound being reopened piece by piece. The transfer receipt, the altered itinerary, the travel agency's statement, all of it laid bare in front of them. My father's lawyer tried to fight back, calling the entire situation a misunderstanding. "Mr. Bennett is a successful man," he argued, pacing in front of the bench. "He's given generously his entire life. This trip was no different." He gestured toward my grandfather. "My clients never forced him to transfer the money. He did so willingly out of love." The judge watched silently, her expression unreadable. Then she asked, "And yet he was left behind at the airport." The attorney hesitated. "There were health concerns," he said finally. "It was an act of kindness, not cruelty." My chest tightened, but before I could react, my grandfather rose from his seat. His voice, though soft, carried through the room. "You call it kindness to take everything I worked for and leave me behind like baggage." The judge didn't stop him. He stood straighter, his hands gripping the back of the chair in front of him. "For 70 years, I built a life so my children would never have to struggle, and they repaid it by turning family into a transaction." The stillness that followed was louder than any outburst could have been. My father stood abruptly. "You're twisting this," Daddy snapped. "You were tired, you said it yourself. We thought we were sparing you the stress of travel." My grandfather turned toward him, his expression unreadable. "You didn't spare me anything," he said. "You took from me the one thing you never earned my trust." My father's mouth opened, but no words came. When it was Caleb's turn to question him, the conversation shifted to tone and motive. "Mr. Bennett," Caleb asked, "did you or your wife ever inform your father that he wouldn't be included in the trip?" My father hesitated, his jaw tightening. "We meant to," he said finally. "Things got busy and the communication just fell through." The judge leaned forward slightly. "Fell through to the tune of $2 million. My father's eyes dropped, and for a brief moment his voice wavered. "We didn't think it would matter," he muttered. "He has plenty." That single sentence landed heavier than any accusation. My grandfather closed his eyes, and I could see the color drain from his face. It was as though he'd finally heard confirmation of something he'd been afraid to admit. The room went silent again, until the judge cleared her throat. "Proceed," she said, her tone sharper now. The defense called my mother next. She walked to the stand with her shoulders squared, careful and composed. Her answers were short, controlled, until Caleb asked one question too many. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, "when you told your father-in-law at the airport to go home, what did you mean by that?" She hesitated. "I was trying to protect him," she replied. "He's old. Traveling that far would have been hard on him." Caleb nodded slightly. "So you made that decision for him after he paid for everyone else?" Her lips pressed together. "It wasn't my call," she said. "It was Stephen's." My father shot her a look, but she didn't meet his eyes. By the time the last witness stepped down, the afternoon light had turned golden through the windows. The judge called for closing arguments. Caleb stood first, his voice steady and low. "This case is about accountability," he said. "No one forced Mr. Thomas Bennett to give his family money. But what they did afterward, taking it under false pretenses, deceiving him, abandoning him, is exploitation. This court exists to protect people from that very thing." My father's lawyer spoke next, repeating the same defense about misunderstanding family and good intentions. But each word seemed smaller now, thinner, like paper stretched too far. When he finished, the judge folded her hands. "I'll review the evidence and deliver my decision tomorrow morning," she said. "Court is adjourned." We left in silence. Outside, the steps of the courthouse glowed in the fading sun. My grandfather paused halfway down, looking out across the street at the city he'd helped build buildings that bore his name, reminders of the years he'd spent shaping something lasting. "Funny," he said quietly. "I never thought I'd have to defend my life's work from my own blood." I walked beside him, unsure what to say. He rested his hand briefly on my shoulder, then nodded toward the car. "Let's go home. I want to sleep before tomorrow." That night, the house was still. I heard the creak of his footsteps above me once, then nothing. I sat by the kitchen window long after midnight, the moonlight spilling over the counter, trying not to imagine what the verdict would bring. At dawn, the sound of the front door woke me. He was already dressed, coffee in hand, his expression clear and calm. "You ready?" he asked. I nodded, though my heart thudded in my chest. The drive back to the courthouse felt shorter this time. When we walked in, the air inside carried that strange, anticipatory quiet that comes before a storm. The judge entered precisely at 9. Papers rustled, chairs scraped. Then the room went still. Judge Graves looked over the rim of her glasses. After reviewing all evidence and testimony, she began, "This court finds sufficient proof of financial abuse and intentional deceit." My father's head dropped. My aunt gasped softly. The judge continued, her voice firm. "Stephen Bennett, Mary Ann Bennett, Patricia Holden, and Robert Holden are hereby ordered to repay the full amount of $2 million to Mr. Thomas Bennett. Furthermore, all 4 parties are stripped of inheritance rights and guardianship privileges moving forward." The words hung in the air like a bell still ringing. My father slammed his hand on the table, but the judge didn't flinch. "This is an outrage," he shouted. "We're his family." Judge Graves looked straight at him. "Exactly," she said, "and that makes your actions all the more shameful." The gavel struck once hard and final. My grandfather exhaled slowly, closing his eyes, as though releasing years of breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Caleb placed a hand on his shoulder, murmuring something quietly before turning to leave. My family sat frozen, their faces drained of color, their future rearranged in an instant. As we stepped outside, the morning light felt different, brighter, sharper, almost cleansing. My grandfather stopped at the bottom of the courthouse steps, breathing in deeply. "It's over," he said. I looked at him, at the peace settling across his features. "It's finally over." He smiled faintly, the corners of his eyes softening. "No," he said, turning toward me. "It's just beginning." His words carried no bitterness, only a kind of quiet conviction. As we walked toward the car, I understood what he meant. Justice had been served, but what came next would define what we did with it. The days after the verdict moved slowly, as if the world needed time to adjust to what had changed. My grandfather and I returned home to the quiet Charleston estate that now felt lighter somehow. The air didn't carry the same heaviness it had before, and the silence between us wasn't a burden anymore, it was peaceful. He spent that first afternoon on the back porch, sitting in his favorite chair, with the newspaper folded in his lap, though he barely glanced at it. The soft creak of the chair matched the rhythm of his breathing, steady and calm. "Feels strange," he said finally, eyes on the horizon. "To win something you never wanted to fight for." I sat beside him, the smell of salt from the marsh drifting through the air. "You didn't win, Grandpa," I said. "You were heard." He gave a faint nod, his fingers tapping the armrest. "That's what makes it different." Over the next week, I watched him return to the routines that had once filled his days. He woke early again, made breakfast himself, and walked the property before the heat set in. But there was something new in the way he carried himself, an ease, a quiet pride that hadn't been there in years. The judgment hadn't just restored what was stolen, it gave him back a sense of belonging to his own life. Letters began to arrive, some from neighbors, others from people he hadn't spoken to in decades. Many shared stories about their own families, how they had trusted too much or stayed silent too long. My grandfather read each one carefully, then placed them in a wooden box on his desk. "People don't talk about this kind of thing," he said one morning, adjusting his glasses. "They're ashamed, like it's a sign of weakness to be betrayed." He looked at me, then a spark of determination in his eyes. Maybe it's time we changed that. That afternoon, he asked me to help him make some calls. He wanted to start something, a small trust, maybe even a foundation to help protect other seniors from financial abuse. We spent the evening drafting a plan at the kitchen table, papers spread out between us. He spoke about using the money that had been returned to him, not to rebuild what was lost, but to build something new. "If my story can keep one person from going through what I did," he said, "then it'll mean something." The following days were a blur of phone calls and meetings. Caleb connected us with a nonprofit attorney who specialized in senior protection, and she helped set up the legal groundwork. We named it the Thomas Bennett Foundation, and my grandfather insisted that the mission statement be simple: to defend dignity where it's been forgotten. Watching him work again, focused, purposeful, alive, was like watching the man I remembered from my childhood, the one who built skyscrapers and neighborhoods and still came home in time to fix a broken toy. A few weeks later, we visited a community center in North Charleston to announce the foundation's first grant. The room was filled with seniors, their families, and volunteers. My grandfather stood at the podium, a simple microphone before him, no teleprompter, no notes. His voice carried steady through the room. "I thought I built a fortune," he said, pausing to glance at me. "But I learned that what really matters is how you use it when the world goes quiet." The applause that followed wasn't loud, but it was warm, the kind that settles deep and stays. After the event, a woman named Irene Foster, a retired teacher, came up to him. Her husband had passed years ago, and she'd nearly lost her savings to a distant relative who forged her signature. She told him how helpless she'd felt until she heard about his case on the local news. My grandfather took her hand in both of his. "You're not alone anymore," he said. The way she smiled back at him told me that in that moment he was already changing lives. That night we drove home under a pink-orange sky. He was quiet most of the way, the faint hum of the radio filling the car. When we pulled into the driveway, he didn't get out right away. "You know," he said softly, "when your father was little, I used to tell him a man's worth isn't measured by what he earns, but by what he protects. Somewhere along the way, I forgot to remind him. His voice trailed off, and I saw something settle behind his eyes. Not regret exactly, but understanding. The next morning, he called Caleb to thank him. I listened from the hallway as he said, "You didn't just help me, son. You gave me a reason to keep going." Caleb laughed, a sound full of warmth. "You did the hard part, Mr. Bennett," he replied. "You stood up." When the call ended, my grandfather turned toward me. "He's right, you know," he said, smiling faintly. But I had someone to stand with me. In the following months, the foundation grew faster than either of us expected. Donations came in from local businesses, and a small team of volunteers began handling outreach. I helped with communications, coordinating events, and writing updates for our website. My grandfather became something of a local figure, not for his wealth or business record, but for his courage. People stopped him at the grocery store to thank him, shaking his hand with genuine gratitude. Each time he'd smile modestly and say, "Just doing what should have been done long ago." Still, not every day was easy. Sometimes he'd receive a letter from my father or aunt, apologies, written too late or too carefully to feel real. He'd read them quietly, then fold them back into their envelopes. "Forgiveness," he said one afternoon, "isn't something you rush. It's something you grow into." I understood. The wounds they left behind weren't the kind that vanished just because justice had been served. One evening in early fall, as the cicadas buzzed outside, he and I sat on the porch again. The air was cooler, and the scent of rain drifted in from the coast. He leaned back, a blanket draped across his knees. "You know, Grace," he said, "I used to think legacy meant buildings and bank accounts. But it's not. It's what people remember about how you treated them." He turned his head toward me, smiling softly. "And I hope they remember you for your courage." I wanted to tell him the same, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I just nodded, watching as he closed his eyes, the sound of the evening settling around us like a lullaby. The porch light flickered, the crickets sang, and for the first time since that awful day at the airport, I felt peace in every corner of that house. When I helped him inside later, he paused by the framed newspaper article hanging on the wall, one announcing the foundation's launch. "Not bad for an old man," he joked, tapping the glass. Then he turned to me, more serious now. "Promise me something, Grace. When I'm gone, keep it going. Make sure no one forgets why we started." "I promise," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. "Good," he murmured, "because this isn't just my story anymore. It's ours." He went to bed early that night, and as I closed the door behind him, I caught a glimpse of his reflection in the mirror, peaceful content almost glowing in the dim light. I stood there for a long moment, realizing how far we'd both come from the woman and the man who had walked out of that airport in silence. The next morning, the house was quiet again, but it didn't feel empty. Sunlight streamed through the windows, landing across his chair on the porch. His coffee mug sat where he'd left it, the paper folded beside it. The foundation paperwork was stacked neatly on the desk, signed and sealed. The life he'd fought to reclaim had finally become something lasting. And as I looked out across the garden, the wind carried the faint scent of roses just beginning to bloom again. The morning after my grandfather passed was unusually still. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, catching the dust in the air like 1,000 slow-moving stars. His chair on the porch sat empty, the blanket folded neatly across the back. I found his coffee cup on the counter, half filled, the steam long gone. The house didn't feel empty. It felt paused, as if waiting for him to return from one of his morning walks. The funeral was small, just as he wanted. A handful of neighbors, old business partners, and a few of the families the foundation had already helped came to pay their respects. Caleb attended too, standing quietly in the back, his hat pressed to his chest. When it was my turn to speak, I walked up to the podium with shaking hands, the scent of lilies and polished wood heavy around me. I looked out at the faces, some tearful, some simply reflective, and said, "My grandfather believed that doing the right thing might not fix the world, but it could fix a small piece of it, and that's what he did." After the service, people lingered under the oaks sharing stories. One man approached me with a firm handshake. "Your grandfather gave me my first construction job 30 years ago," he said. "He taught me more than blueprints. He taught me how to keep my word. Others echoed the same kind of gratitude. Their words blended into a quiet hum of memory, each story a thread in the life he left behind. When the last guest had gone, I stood beside his grave a while longer. The marble marker was simple, engraved only with his name dates, and the words, "He built more than homes, he built hope." I brushed my hand across the stone and whispered, "I'll keep it going. I promise." The following weeks moved like soft waves, one day fading into the next. The foundation became my full-time focus. There were grants to review, phone calls to return, and new requests for help coming in every week. Caleb stopped by often to check on the progress, and Irene became a close friend helping with community outreach. Together we made sure the foundation stayed true to what my grandfather envisioned, helping seniors recover from financial abuse, guiding families through the same kind of betrayal he had endured. One afternoon, while sorting through donation letters, an envelope caught my eye. The handwriting was familiar, tight, and deliberate. My father's. I hesitated before opening it, tracing the edge of the flap as my chest tightened. Inside was a single page folded once. His words were brief. "Grace, I heard about your grandfather. I'm sorry for how things ended. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me someday." There was no return address, no apology big enough to cover the silence of the past year. I folded the letter back and placed it in the top drawer of my desk, not to throw away, just to keep there until I decided what to do with it. Forgiveness, as my grandfather once said, had to grow in its own time. A few days later, I visited the foundation's office, a modest brick building downtown with a brass plaque by the door. The waiting area was filled with light from the tall windows. A couple sat by the front desk filling out forms while a volunteer explained the process. Their faces reminded me of my grandfather's on the day at the airport, worn but hopeful, like they were standing at the edge of something fragile. I spent the morning meeting with our board, approving the next round of grants. We had just reached our 50th case, a retired veteran who had lost his savings to a predatory lender. Watching these lives rebuild piece by piece gave me the same feeling my grandfather must have felt on that porch, quiet satisfaction mixed with a sense of purpose. Before I left, I added a note to his photo that hung in the lobby, "We're still building." That evening, I stopped by the Charleston waterfront. The air smelled of salt and rain, and gulls circled lazily above the pier. I leaned against the railing, listening to the water hit the pylons below. A man stood a few feet away, older, with weathered hands and a fishing rod propped beside him. He nodded toward the water. "Good spot for thinking," he said. I smiled faintly. It was my grandfather's favorite place. He looked at me for a moment, then said, "Sounds like he taught you well." I nodded, unable to find the right words. We stood there a while longer, two strangers sharing a stretch of silence that felt comforting. When he finally reeled in his line and packed up, he gave a small wave before walking down the pier. Back home, the house no longer felt like the echo it once was. The scent of sawdust still lingered faintly from his workshop, and the roses he'd planted bloomed in full color outside the window. I walked through each room, slowly touching the edges of picture frames, running my fingers along the bookshelves he built decades ago. On his desk, beneath a neatly stacked pile of papers, I found a sealed envelope addressed to me. My breath caught. I opened it carefully. His handwriting filled the page, steady and familiar. "Grace," it began. "If you're reading this, I've gone on to where the noise of the world can't reach me. I don't have much advice left to give. But here's what I know. Family isn't always born. Sometimes it's built. You built it for me when everyone else walked away. Keep building for them, for yourself. And when you doubt whether it mattered, look around. You'll see it in the lives you've touched. That's where I'll be." I sat at his desk for a long time after that, the sound of the clock ticking softly in the background. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the branches against the windows like a familiar knock. That weekend, the foundation hosted a small gathering to celebrate its first year. We decorated the community hall with simple white flowers and photographs of every senior we'd helped. Caleb spoke first, sharing how the foundation had grown from one man's story into something far larger than anyone expected. When it was my turn, I looked around the room at the faces of those who had once been strangers, but now felt like family. "My grandfather used to say that dignity is a kind of home," I began. He believed everyone deserves to live in one. Because of all of you, that belief has a home now, too. As the crowd applauded, I felt a warmth in my chest, the same kind I used to feel when he'd clap for me at my piano recitals as a child. Later that night, when the hall had emptied and the lights dimmed, I stood alone by his photograph, the one taken just before the airport trip. His smile was easy, his eyes bright. "We did it, Grandpa," I whispered. "We built something that lasts." Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, soft and steady. I stepped under the awning, listening to it drum gently against the roof. In the distance, thunder rolled over the marshes, low and steady, like a heartbeat returning to rhythm. And though the night stretched quiet and long ahead of me, it no longer felt empty. It felt full of stories still unfolding, of people still standing, of promises kept. The kind of fullness that comes only when justice finally meets peace. The night after the Foundation's anniversary celebration, I sat on the porch with the rain still pattering softly against the railing. The air smelled like wet earth and roses, and for a moment I could almost imagine my grandfather sitting beside me again, his hand wrapped around a mug of coffee, his quiet laugh rolling through the air. The memory didn't ache the way it used to. It settled gently, like the warmth of a light left on in another room. The months that followed brought a new rhythm to life. The Thomas Bennett Foundation kept growing, expanding to nearby counties, partnering with banks and legal aid groups. Each new case reminded me how many lives could be changed with patience and persistence. Caleb stayed involved as an advisor, and Irene joined the board full-time, her steady voice and teacher's heart keeping us grounded. I often thought about how proud my grandfather would have been to see what he started become something that outlived him. Every so often, I'd get a letter from someone who had heard his story. A retired mechanic in Ohio, a widow in Florida, a social worker in Texas, all writing to say his courage helped them take the first step toward reclaiming their own dignity. Those letters became my favorite part of every week. I kept them in the same wooden box my grandfather once used for his mail, the one still marked with faint coffee stains on the lid. Spring came early that year. The roses in the garden bloomed thick and bright, covering the fence line in color. I spent one Saturday morning trimming them back, careful not to disturb the bird's nest tucked near the gate. As I worked, I found myself humming one of the old songs my grandfather used to whistle when we fixed things together. The sound floated across the yard, quiet but steady, and for the first time I realized I was at peace with everything that had happened. Later that day, I drove out to the cemetery. The oak trees along the path were full of new leaves, and the air felt alive with spring. I brought a single white rose and laid it beside his headstone. For a while, I just stood there listening to the wind move through the branches. "We're doing good work, Grandpa," I said softly. "You started something that still matters." The breeze picked up, brushing my hair across my cheek, and I took it as the only answer I needed. Before leaving, I sat on the bench nearby and watched the sunlight fall across the rows of graves. It struck me how fragile and enduring a life could be. At the same time, how one act of decency, one moment of courage could ripple outward long after the person was gone. My grandfather's story began with betrayal, but it ended with something far greater. It ended with restoration, with grace, and with proof that even broken families can leave behind something beautiful if one person chooses to stand up. That night, back at home, I opened his last letter again. The paper had softened with age, the ink faint in places where I'd read it too many times. "Keep building," he had written. "When the world forgets what kindness looks like, remind it." I traced the words with my finger, smiling through the tears I didn't bother to hide. The house felt alive around me again, the ticking clock, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the porch steps, all reminders that life keeps moving quietly but faithfully. I closed the letter, set it back in its envelope, and walked outside. The night sky was clear, the air cool and still. Across the yard, the lights from the Foundation's small office glowed through the trees, steady and bright. I knew that tomorrow would bring more work, more stories, more people to help. But for tonight, the quiet was enough. As I stood there, I thought about what he had taught me, that justice doesn't always come with applause, that sometimes it's just a single act done with integrity, even when no one is watching. And that love, the kind that asks for nothing in return, is the most powerful form of justice there is. So if you're listening to this, take a moment to think about the people who've shaped your life, the ones who stood by you when others turned away. Maybe reach out or simply remember them with gratitude. And if this story meant something to you, share it with someone who might need a little reminder that dignity and kindness still matter. Because in the end, that's what my grandfather left me. Not his fortune, not his name, but the understanding that real wealth isn't in what we have. It's in what we give back and who we choose to become after the storm.